Okay, so we have got the first point that we discussed was the definition. So let's now talk about why does the body need to produce HCl in the first place? Okay, so what's the role of HCl? It has got two principal functions. One, say A, is to sterilize the food. So the food intake, so along with the food, there is an entry of bacteria. Okay, so in ingestion, the, the food along with the bacteria is ingested. And so once it reaches the stomach, the HCl kills the bacteria. Okay. So the first function is to protect the body from potentially harmful bacteria. And so how does the body do that? It utilizes HCl. So HCl, the concentration of HCl within the stomach is not a conducive environment for the bacteria to thrive. Okay? So this bacteria, they die, they become metabolically inactive. Okay? So the HCl kills the potentially dangerous bacteria, okay, ingested along with food. So the next reason is that one of the components of food, so food has got basically the main components would be proteins, fats, and carbs, carbohydrates. So if complex proteins are consumed and they're masticated in the mouth, and then when they come into contact with the HCl, there is a hydrolysis. So proteolysis takes place. Okay, so there is some hydrolysis brought about by HCl, and um, and that results in further breakdown of the broken down proteins by pepsinogen. Okay, so we said that there are chief cells. Chief cells, they primarily produce pepsinogen, which is a zymogen, meaning it's an inactive form of the protein. So in presence of HCl, this pepsinogen gets converted to pepsin. Okay, and this pepsin is a proteolytic enzyme. Okay. So the food that has undergone hydrolysis by HCl, they are subsequently acted upon by pepsin. Okay, and so there is a digestion of proteins. Okay. So in the grand scheme of things, the majority of the protein digestion takes place in the small intestine, but it begins in the stomach. Okay, it is not one of the so the stomach is not the main area where proteins are digested, but the process begins in the stomach. Okay. Um, which would make us think what would happen if there is no HCl. Okay? What if there is no HCl? Okay? So if there is no HCl, that would produce a condition which is called echlorhydria. Okay? So where there is reduction in the HCl production, or there is no production of HCl in the stomach, that condition is called echlorhydria. So intuitively we would understand that it's not very conducive to the body. It wouldn't kill the ingested bacteria, nor would it be able to do the first process of protein processing, the digestion part. Okay. So this is not a very desired state, but it is pathogenic. So what can we do? We could replace the absent HCl, the hydrochloric acid. Okay. So how do we do that? We would administer 5 to 10 ml of dilute HCl. So by dilute HCl we mean 10% HCl. Okay. And we would further dilute this to 100 to 200 ml with water. And then we would ask the patient to ingest it using a straw. Okay. Why? Because we want the patient to protect their teeth. Okay. So the acid, if it's taken directly, it's going to harm the teeth. Okay. So the patient, we would instruct the patient to consume it using a straw. So from this, what we understand is that the HCl is important physiologically. It's important physiologically. Uh, uh, it has got important functions. Okay. So now the question is, what if there is excess if there is increased HCl production, what would happen? Okay. So if we look at the stomach, again a diagrammatic representation of the stomach, if there is excess of HCl, it can have two consequences. One, it can reflux into the esophagus. Okay, so esophagus is this tube that brings the food into the stomach. So if there is excess of acid, it could go back. Okay. So this is normally prevented by something called the lower esophageal sphincter. Okay, so which is a band of smooth muscles which contract after the food reaches the stomach, and that in turn prevents the contents of the stomach being pushed back into the esophagus. Okay. So there is this lower esophageal sphincter. And what could happen pathologically is that if the lower esophageal sphincter loses its normal contracted state, then there can be increased frequency and duration, increased frequency and duration of opening of the LES, which would push more acid into the esophagus, and that may result in erosion, which in turn may result in an ulcer formation. Okay? And if it is not treated, what could happen is there could be perforation. And by perforation, we mean there can be a hole that's created in the wall of the esophagus, and that can leak the gastric contents into the peritoneum. Okay. And this perforation therefore can cause peritonitis, and this peritonitis is life-threatening. Okay. So this peritonitis is life-threatening, okay, which is not desired. So this is one of the consequences. Okay. The other consequence could be that this HCl goes into the duodenum. So duodenum is the first part of the small intestine. Okay. So the other parts are duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. So you've got duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. Okay, from top to bottom, that's the parts of the small intestine. Okay, so the parts of the small intestine are duodenum, jejunum, and ileum, and the first part is duodenum. So what can happen is this acid, increased acid, can in the same way as in the esophagus, it can cause erosion, and that can lead to ulceration, and this can again lead to perforation. Okay, and that in turn can cause again peritonitis. Okay. So there are these two important consequences of a pathological increase in HCl. Okay. So one of the conditions that can cause this increase is, yes, absolutely right, ZE syndrome. Okay. So that is a pathological condition. So the reflux into the esophagus, we call it GERD. Okay, gastroesophageal reflux disease. So when this reflux continues with a greater frequency and greater duration, and it is associated with pain, we call it GERD. Okay, gastroesophageal reflux disease. Okay, so I think I'll write it down somewhere here. Gastroesophageal reflux disease. Okay. Also to remember, we need to remember that after the stomach, the duodenum, it forms kind of a C-shaped anatomical structure. Into this C-shaped area, the hepatopancreatic duct opens. Okay, the hepatopancreatic duct opens. Okay. So that brings bile. Okay, so this bile contains bile salts. Okay, so the gastric juice contains pepsin. Okay, so pepsin in the presence of bile salts and HCl is a very potent mixture that can really harm or degrade unprotected parts of the GIT. Okay. So all these in concert are responsible for the ulcers being formed. Okay. So that is the consequence of excess of acid.